Should I
I will.
start?
I will
No.
introduce.
Yeah, you.
Yeah, yeah. All right, we're good to go. Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming to the fourth session of the two-day conference, the HLCI, which the concept today is input, output, archeologies, and future, where we're trying to blend the past, the future, the present, what was live coding, what is live coding, what live coding could be, and how it meshes with other things. To start us off today, we have Agate with Towards a Theory of Generative Knitting.
So, share screen. So, hello everyone, and thanks for having me. My name is Agathe, but you might know me better as TH4. So, one of my hobbies is live coding music with tidal cycles, but another of my hobbies is to knit lace shawls with intricate patterns with a lot of holes. And so I wondered, could I bring these two passions together? Could I extend tidal cycles so that it could generate knitting patterns from base patterns and with combination instructions? So in this presentation, I will explore to what extent this could be done, which challenges should be, well, maybe not challenges, but like which questions should be solved before we can do that. And so first I'm going to start with a bit of knitting terminology, also because there is some ambiguity. So a stitch is just the base, the most elemental bit of knitting. It's like the thing that is formed by a loop of thread over the needle, and you have different qualities of stitches, which I'll introduce later. So pattern is the ambiguous term, because in knitting, a pattern is the set of instructions for making a finished garment. But in procedural art, it's more like a sequence, an element that can be repeated and then manipulated, transformed, etc. And so I will use this latter meaning, and for a complete for the description of a complete garment, I will use the term model. So you have lots of different types of stitches, which are differentiated through how they attach to the loops below. So you have the base, the normal stitches, which are purl and knit. So here you have purl, you have knit. You have decreases that create one less loops, one less stitches. So here we have knit two together, and here you have slip knit, yeah. And so this this is one loop that goes through two loops below, and you have the opposite. You have increases, so you can do a yarn over by putting your yarn over the needle and creating a loop out of thin yarn. And you can also make one by putting your needle into a thread below. And so combining increases and decreases is what will result in lace patterns with holes and more intricate patterns. And so if we want to create a system for generating patterns, what we would want from it is a fundamental thing is that it should generate valid patterns. And so that in my eyes, this means mainly two things: is that we from one row to another, the number of stitches are compatible. Like, for example, if one row creates 8 stitches, then the next row should demand to knit into 8 stitches, not 7, because otherwise we would have a stitch hanging alone. And also, like, increases and decreases are, here you have a decrease that brings two stitches together, but it's still a unit. It's not splittable. So like a generative pattern should not split increases or decreases. And so my starting point is is very inspired by tidal cycles, and is going through the seminal paper by Laurie Spiegel about manipulations of musical patterns, and looking at which of these manipulations can be applied to knitting. So here in red, you have 3 transformations that just don't apply to knitting because they have to do with the numerical values of music, like frequency, volume, etc. And knitting stitches just don't have numerical values, so these are art. On the opposite, you have repetition, which is applicable without any caveats. And in orange, I put the ones that should be adaptable, but demand a little bit of thinking. And so I'm going to present 3 of them. So rotation and phase offset, which I'm bringing together, rescaling, and combination. So to rescale patterns, to rescale a pattern, since knitting is discrete, you can't always scale down. Like sometimes you can, but you can mostly scale up, like repeat the stitches. So here you see here, each stitch is repeated once in the Y direction, once in the X direction. It's the other way around, but whatever. And so here you have twice scaled the pattern. You can also rotate patterns. So here I have a pattern with some increases that I have rotated by 2 or 3. So you see here you have a block of stitches that ends up at the end of the pattern. So here the rotation is applied to all the rows in the same way. And you have also phase offset, which is like rotation, but it's a different rotation for each row. And here you see that it doesn't really make a valid pattern because you have a yarn over at the edge of the yarn, and so it's a bit undoable. And you can also combine patterns. So here I decided you have a lot of different ways to combine patterns, and here I decided to just alternate stitches from the 2 different patterns. So you have 1 stitch from here, 1 stitch from here, etc. You can check by yourself. And so that's all I have to say. If you have any questions or suggestions or want to further this project, please tell me. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. And one question I have, and if anyone in chat has a question, and if you have a question, you can always ask it later. But one question I do have is, I was thinking back of what Char said in the previous session about, like, a spear keyboard. But all I was thinking at the time was, like, if you think about it, like the interface is the knitting, right?
Yeah.
Like in this one, like your keyboard is the sticks. So how do you like, if you were to translate it, how does it feel? Like, do you feel like you're coding? Does it feel, or is it how the hands feel and all that stuff? If you can explain that.
Yeah. Well, the way I like to put it in analogy with computer stuff is that this generative knitting I propose would be like a compiler from a high-level program to machine code, which is actually the knitting instructions, and then the processor is the knitter. You are a human processor. So, well, you have knitting machines, but they're not. I have never used one. So, but yeah, in this case, the knitter would be the one executing the code.
Yeah, it's because it's very interesting when you think about the interface on how the hands move, right? Like, keyboard,
Yeah.
we're going down. In this one, you're going up,
Mm.
down, stretch. And then before going to the next thing, we have one question which we're going to fit in. Alex mentioned great stuff. I'm wondering what you have made so far, whether that turn up any surprises, and when the code turn up something unknittable, and whether as a human knitter you can still find a way to interpret it successfully.
So for now, it's very speculative. What I have done is a program in Python that generates SVGs to represent patterns, to like visualize them. But for now, well, I can show you. It's here. For now, it's very. It's mostly it's like the super dirt part of the thing. It doesn't really. Here I have a function for combining patterns. So, sorry. For now, it's it does create. It can create unusable patterns. There is some checking in the program, because you see here I have slanted stitches to show that they attach further. It's not. I don't know. For now, it's very speculative, and so I beside this very end of the chain thing, I haven't implemented anything. I don't know if that answers
It
the question.
answers, because speculative is still something, right? Like you still have something there. So and that's the whole point. You get an idea out and then it moves forward. So thank you very much for that. And then if you have more questions, we shall ask them in the Q&A. So thank you very much for that. And now we're proceeding to go from a past form to maybe what some might consider a futuristic form with Kate, topic robots and helping hands.
Thank you so much. Let me share my video here. Great. And I'm just gonna play this and talk over it. Actually, let me bring the sound down a little bit more. So hello, I'm Kate Sicchio. I'm a choreographer, and I've been live coding dances for over 12 years now, I think. So I'm really interested in how we can use code to generate movement scores and instructions for movement. And that sort of led me kind of naturally to working with robotics. So over the last few years, I've made several different pieces with different robots of various sizes. But particularly since 2021, I've been collaborating with a roboticist, Dr. Patrick Martin at University of Richmond. And we use small manipulator robots. You'll see one in a moment on the screen. And so it's basically a Roomba with an arm. So it can move around the space, but it also can, it has an arm that also has movement that can be choreographed. So we've been making these pieces with humans and robots together. The piece you're viewing now is our one of 3 pieces that we've done this way with humans and robots together. And particularly in this one, we started trying to live code instructions for both the robot, but also for interactions for the human and robots. So what that means in this particular piece is we have these floor projections. They're actually some web shaders that I can live code. And the actual projections have a couple different, statuses I can code. So they can be sort of these solid states, or these, you can see on the robot, there's like some rings coming off the animation on the floor. So this is like indicating to the performer to there's a phrase of movement and a series of gestures they can pull from, and they can basically improvise with that. And then there's the next sort of phase, which is spatial arrangements that I can live code. And so these actually, you'll see, I'll sort of arm comes off of the floor projection and connects to another blob. And this indicates whether the performer should go towards or away. So we use repel and attract were the sort of movement words we were using with in this piece. I'll scrub forward a little bit so you can see more of what I'm talking about. There we go. So you can see they're starting to connect. So this would be a moment where I'm telling all three of them to come together. So they end up in this clump, sort of circling each other. And there, right there, you can see a moment that I'm going to specifically talk about where the dancer actually touches the robot. So this was something that was really unintentional in this work, but became really important in this work. So what happened was we have all these floor patterns. I'm live coding them. The dancers are interpreting them. We got this white box theater, which is pretty rare in performance. I was very excited about. I was like, the black robot's going to look amazing in the white. The projections are going to look amazing on the white floor. It turns out it's a very old performance space in New York. I absolutely adore this space. It's called Theater Lab. But the floor was extremely uneven, which meant our robot got stuck a lot on the floor. So what would happen is we would have to have these moments where if the robot was stuck, the dancers would actually have to go up and touch the robot, and the robot could be unstuck and would move. This was very unintentional, but became very much part of the choreography. The dancers also started touching each other on the shoulder as a way to incorporate it into their own vocabulary with each other as well. And this was something that also the audience read as something very important as well. So in the audience survey after the piece and in an audience discussion after the piece, a lot of them saw the robot as like the dancer's little sister, or like a lost child, or a pet, or one of the dancers refers to the robot as a puppy all the time. And part of this was this helplessness of this robot and having to see the dancers actually assist the robot. So there's a couple other moments where this happens. I'll fast forward to. These ones are a little harder to see, I think, in the documentation than that first one. But here's another moment. So the robot's very stuck, and there's one of the dancers that's behind someone's knee, unsticking the robot. And there's one that comes towards the end, too. So why is this interesting in the context of live coding? Well, I think because we're looking at this idea of improvisation, how to make technology respond in a context where it is open-ended, where it is about agency, this became something really interesting that like not being scripted means we didn't have to like run out and go and like rescue the robot, right? We actually could play with that and make it a moment in the piece. And clearly that held meaning for the audience as well. So yeah, this agency allowed for meaning to be made. And it also like kind of made this magic moment of, yeah, a helpless robot needing this intimacy with people in order to, yeah, actually make the piece work. So yeah, I'm gonna leave it at that. So thank you for letting me show that moment in this piece.
Yeah, that was very great, Kate. So I have a question, and if in chat if you have a question. So you talk about agency, but it's very interesting, and maybe you can speak on because there's an extension of self, right? That you like with knitting, your hands are moving, but in this one, the robot is moving. But it's interesting that the extension of self is not only through the coding, the dances, but it's also through the relationship back, right? Because you said that people refer to it as a pet or even as a baby sister. So what do you think about the personification or through your code that you're able to translate something that is not even human into something that people can relate to?
Yeah, I think one of the things I was really interested in was this idea of proxemics and like how intimate and how much space do we need to like feel a certain like implication of, usually we talk about it in terms of people in social contexts, right? Like if someone's like a certain amount of feet away from us, we don't feel necessarily like intimate with them. But if they're very close to us, then we think of them as like an intimate relationship. And I was really interested in if that would convey in robotics, because in our previous work, which was called Amelia and the Machine, the piece also started with the dancer touching the robot and moving it. And because it started that way, people also saw this very intimate relationship. Like in the previous work, people were like, oh, is this a piece about you and your son? I was like, no. But that spatial closeness and that touch, I think, is what personifies the machine in this work. And that was something I was intentionally trying to play with in this piece, was like, okay, if I put things far away, are they lonely? Are they like, yeah, does it become just a robot? But when it ends up brushing up against a dancer, and when a dancer has to physically help it, then does it become something else? Yeah.
And I think that correlates. I think that's a great segue to what Char said in chat, where Char says, "Love this. Is there kind of a key for the audience to know the instructions for the floor patterns convey?"
Yeah. The only sort of key is that it repeats. So you can see in the blobs, I think it becomes clear that like there's this thing coming out and extending to the other dancers, and that's throughout. And then when the dancers sort of stop and do a more gestural phase and this animation comes out, like that repeats too. So like there's actually very few instructions for me to live code. But I am sort of, yeah, deciding things in the performance. But because of that repetition, that's what I'm hoping the audience like learns, right? Like, oh, there's a clear mapping here. So that's the only clue they get, is that it repeats. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that answers the question. Thank you very much, Kate. And if you have any questions, you can always ask during the Q&A or during the time. So now we have went from knitting, we have went to robots. But what about our own process? And Katerina's going to explain this with the concept of artistic iteration as research.
Hi, everyone. Um, so, okay. So, so I'm Katerina. So I'm going to talk about artistic iteration as research. So, as background, when I was in school, we were studying the theories of research, and one of the types of theories that we came across was practice-based research. As an original investigation that you undertake in order to gain new knowledge. Specifically by this, they don't mean personal knowledge, but they mean collective knowledge. And this is partly by means of practice and through the outcomes of practice. And I think this is really related to what live coders do as a group. And so if a creative artifact is the basis of the contribution to knowledge, we say that the research is practice-based. So that could be a performance, that can be, if you do installation art as well, like me, that can be an installation, specifically when people are interacting with it, not just like, say, your code and not just your rig. And so this is important because last year at this particular conference, I was talking about experimental design and basically how I saw some similarities between some of the scientific training I've had and some of the things I do when I'm testing for myself, doing personal experiments in, say, a live coding context or in an art experience context. And I was asked, so have you actually used experimental design to create art experiences and live coding sets? And I was thinking about it, and I didn't really try very hard to do that before. And so this past year, I've been trying a bit harder to figure out, can I frame my work as an experimental design, specifically the sort that creates collective knowledge. So when creating collective knowledge, I want to support theories, through iteration use, specifically like if I've chosen a configuration to use for live coding, or if I've chosen a configuration to use for an installation. What about this, the way I've set everything up, encourages the experience I want the audience to come away with, or participants to come away with, and like basically what's making this useful to them and helping them generate knowledge themselves. And then basically streamlining feedback and activity documentation so that this is something that's easily, well, not easily, but comparable from instance to instance, and also, I guess, repeatable by other people. So I have mostly been working with 2 different sets of projects with this. So the first is the motion series of interactive sound installations. And then the second is my live coding flute rig. So the motion series of interactive sound installations uses an overhead camera to basically pick up where people are in a space, and as they move through the space, their motions will trigger the playback of sounds in different ways based off of how fast they're moving and where in the space they are. Different sounds will play back, and this leads to different motions that they'll undertake within the space, because they create feedback, and all sorts of factors play into how that works out. And then the second one is live coding flute rig. So with this, I play flute, and I play flute and use it as input into a Mac patch, which I then manipulate. And there have been various iterations of me manipulating. Right now, it's still, it's undergoing changes. So both of them are works in progress. And as I iterate upon it, it is becoming less and less of a looper, and I'm starting to integrate more little changes that you can make in Mac. But it's something where the audience can see very easily what's happening, and understand what's happening, and it helps me collaborate with visualists. Anyway, how have these changed over time in this process, and how have I been trying to make them into collective knowledge, or see if I could couch them as collective knowledge is the point. So there were 4 instances of the motion interactive sound installation this past year, and they were in very different setups. So they're based off of where it was physically possible to mount the camera. The spaces where the camera can be mounted is very different, and that actually changes the sounds that are produced a lot, which changes the motions people will undergo, and changes the whole setup of how I have to write the code. And so does the physical space. In a larger space, people are more likely to make expressive motions. In a tight hallway, people are more likely to want to turn or do things sideways, and make smaller motions, play with height, things of that nature. And then I had different ways of collecting feedback from participants. It could be talking, it could be standing somewhere farther away and watching from afar, which is easy to do in an amphitheater or a warehouse, but less easy to do in a small hallway, leaving sticky notes and feedback forms. And then in the case of the flute rig, I experimented with typing inputs versus sliders and buttons only, trying to make some code to take input more clearly from just me playing the flute, because switching between the flute to the computer is a little bit of a hassle, and especially if you're using an external mouse versus only the computer. And then there's what sorts of transformations am I applying to the sound. So I've been experimenting with all of these things, and how to make the process, especially since if I'm focused on computer stuff, it's easy to remember things like building memory clearing into the program or resetting. So it's easier to remember to do that. But when I'm working with a flute, and then all of a sudden I need to, things that I would have thought of doing when I have a computer, when I'm only working on the computer, I forget to do because I've got an instrument in my hand. So there's a lot of just little things like, and it doesn't, practicing more doesn't necessarily help with these little things. So that's what's interesting to me, what I've been picking up. But so is it really generalizable knowledge? And I think it's not yet generalizable knowledge. That doesn't mean it won't get there. But I do think that the fact that there are so many different types of documentation, that I'm allowing for freedom of exploration versus observation, and I can't decide how I really want people to explore yet, and how I want to document. And then because I keep on changing the setup, it's really hard to make it generalizable. So that's everything. Thank you. If you have questions, now is a great time for them. Yeah.
Oh, that was very interesting. It made me think a lot about how when we think of live coding, sometimes we are too much about just the code itself and the screen, which don't get me wrong, it's part of it. But I do like in your documentation, one thing that stood out is like if we are documenting or even iterations, the concept of remote observation, consistent observation, right? Because there's so much to see. And so I don't know if you can explain more of that, because since live coding is temporal, how do you document the temporality of the moment?
Right. How do we? So like, I feel like some of the ways we document like the temporality is definitely through like, if you've got recordings, you're trying to capture your screen, right? You're trying to, oftentimes if you're lucky, you might have someone who's videotaping the entire experience, so you might be able to get a little bit of what the audience is doing and how the audience reacts as well. But a lot of it's in those split second decisions of, oh, this was this interesting sound here. And so I personally have been going back and trying to make notes. Part of the problem with live coding actually is we end so late that I'm far too exhausted to actually take good notes afterwards. So I try to do it the next day, and try to record like conversations I had with audience members and the like. But I haven't really figured out what I consider like a good way to document these things yet.
Yeah. And thank you very much. And Char said in the thing, yeah, I'm also interested in the built-in memory and clearing. And I think it's very interesting that comment, because I don't think I think it was said before you said what you said, but I think we also have to realize there's also internal memory and internal clearing, and that is something that maybe through the Q&A or maybe through more discussions like this that we can gather through. So thank you very much for that. And
You're
just
welcome.
one moment, Alex mentioned too stressed beforehand to remember to click record as well, which I think that if you've been live coding quite a bit, I think that has happened more than once.
Yeah.
So thank you very much for that. And next up, we have Alex, who would be explaining what could happen if we blur the lines between computer languages and natural languages.
Yeah, thanks, Kofi. And Aldi and Kate, it's great to be part of this lovely event. But yeah, that's basically what I want to do in this very short talk, is just to raise this question. It's something that has been in the back of my mind for 15 years or so. But recently I've sort of started talking to a linguist, Wataru Wagaki, who is based in Edinburgh. I found a lot of linguists are really against this whole idea of thinking about programming languages as being anything connected with natural languages at all. Some linguists seem to see them as completely separate categories, but I think there's so much interesting ground to explore in between them. And so it's nice to find a linguist who's open to discuss this. And I just thought it would be nice to kind of open up this question, see who else has some interesting prior art to share or interesting thoughts or wants to discuss it. either now or in the future. But first, a bit of prior art. There's Inform 7, which kind of nudges a little bit towards something a bit like the English language. So this is a language for describing text adventures, so dungeon-based things, usually when you're exploring things by typing commands in sort of pseudo-English. And interestingly, in the most recent version, the language itself has moved by looking like a conventional programming language to itself being sort of pseudo-English. You describe the game world in this English-like language. English, of course, a lot of programming languages are based on English, so the kind of multilingual approach to programming is another sort of way of approaching this. But anyway, another system from 2005 by Craig Latter called Quoth sort of also has this sort of adventure game like interface where you're typing in commands to create rooms and place instruments in them and then tell them to play with each other. Really nice fun experiment from Craig. And more recently this year, Lou Wilson and Dave Ackley had this very trippy talk at Splash about natural code. Here they're kind of coming at it from the perspective of approaching language as computer scientists. So it's sort of in that direction of taking idea of programming languages and applying them to think about how we interact through natural language, through these strange feedback loops. I suppose I'm more interested in taking the other direction, looking at natural language and thinking about how to make programming languages more like them. So I suppose already live coding is quite a lot like speech. It's becoming less and less like software engineering, which is about making fixed products, and something more like expressing yourself live as we do when we talk. So even though we're working with notation, it's sort of for the moment. So it has some of the properties of speech being just like existing maybe for a short period of time to explore an idea rather than as part of a dialogue rather than something where you're just building up an architecture. But the question is, how can we take this further? Maybe try and find a live coding language that changes through use. I suppose that's already true to some extent, where people can change and contribute changes to a live coding environment through the usual free open source protocols. And as programming languages get passed down from one generation of people to the next, I think that will become more interesting as programming languages, live coding languages adapt to the different ways that people will want to think about and make music in the future. And what about other aspects of language like prosody, gesture and shape? I think of all these things as sort of the same thing really. How can you take something very discrete like a series of symbols and sort of add gesture to them, whether it's through sound or handwriting or the arrangement, spatial arrangement of symbols on a table, like in the classic, what was it called? Reactable system made by Sergi Jorda in Barcelona. And and on the topic of prosody, this was a system I made probably 13, 14 years ago, thinking about how the shape of words, like the actual structure of words, in some kind of onomatopoeic sense, can describe sounds. And once you have these kind of onomatopoeic words in the programming language, how that kind of gestural representation within a word can sit within the larger programming language construct. So this is like a model of a drum and the kind of different properties of these words, describe different articulations of that drum. The consonants, I think, were how to hit the drum, and the vowels, how the drum skin should behave in terms of being dampened and tuned. Bit fell there. Yeah, so another example of how we can maybe start pushing language into being more natural, more embodied. And of course, there's Kate, who's already spoken, thinking about how language sits within. So you're not just writing language for talking to a computer, but also having humans that are interpreting as well, like Agatha was showing with knitting. All these things, I think, gradually moving ourselves away from the kind of suburbs of programming languages into the sort of more wild aspects of natural language. And I think actually now is a nice opportunity as AI is sort of taking on a lot of the role of programming in software engineering. But this doesn't apply in the same way to live coding, because live coding is something that humans necessarily do. We do play about with AI things, but that doesn't mean that the AI is trying to replace us. It's just augmenting live coding environments in different ways. I suppose what I mean here is that once programming languages are kind of abandoned as a sort of old-fashioned way of making software, it kind of frees up the world of programming to more kind of humane, human-centric, more natural approaches to using computers with language. I think that's maybe a bit counterintuitive because we think of AI in terms of language, but in terms of things like chat interfaces. But I think there's still a whole world to explore beyond the kind of impenetrable world of large language models, sort of thinking about language in a more human-focused way instead of in terms of these sort of statistical networks. So yeah, that's it. All I had to say, and be to discuss with the others or answer questions.
Yeah. So I would ask a question for you, and then if there's questions in the chat for Alex, let us know. Or then after these questions, we're going to open up to everybody. So I'm interested in that, in the moment you're live coding, we can say that's writing, right? Because we're typing. But it's very interesting that you mentioned, and I was thinking about it, that it actually is closer to maybe speech than written, because a lot of the context that we're writing, we're erasing, right? Like, like that's the concept with showing your code, is that you're showing what was written, but it's not like the hieroglyphics where someone else can relate the context. So what do you think about that like the concept of once we have like written out the code, similar to what Katerina was saying, is that since we don't have documentation, then what is the history of past live coding? Is it more of an oral history that you had to be there, or are there ways to like talk about the pivotal points? So yeah.
Yeah, I think oral history is really nice. I think thinking about live coding as having an oral history, I just find really fascinating because it is so symbolic, so notational, but is just for the moment. And that doesn't mean that once you delete it, it's gone, because it's still in our memories. We can tell each other about it. We can remember what works and tell it, or there might be someone in the audience who might write down a little fragment and take an idea forward in the next performance, and somehow it becomes more alive and more open to change, I think. So it's not archived. I mean, there might be a video recording, but I find the oral history possibilities of it just so engaging, because it kind of brings us back to a different way of thinking about music in the West, because we've been so obsessed with staff notation for so long. But that's not the case everywhere in the world. Other places in the world, they really do they might write things down just to help their memories, but really they share things by talking about it, by singing it to each other.
Yeah.
I've been getting really interested in South Indian Carnatic music lately, and their rhythms are so complex and interesting, I think, partly because they live in memory, and so you need all these tricks to remember them, but which somehow ends up with these really generative rhythms, which just become really complex and open to improvisation and things. I don't know. I've always been in two minds about archiving, because I've always regretted when I haven't archived something, I can't listen to something again. But I think there is something really radical about live coding when you think about the aspects of it which can't be archived, the actual feeling of being there in the room. You can't fully capture, really. So yeah.
Yeah.
A good question.
Yeah.
But I haven't got a solid answers. But
Oh, no. It was just something that goes in because I've been thinking about it. And everyone, we can join in because now we're going to start our group panel. And Melody has a great question that I think segues based still on the oral history. Gesture seems to be a common thread topic in these talks. It also seems to be part of a current development emergent syntax, swiping on screens, developing more experimental interfaces. Melody's wondering if people have more to say about that, like speculation, hopes, and dreams on gestures.
Okay, so I would like to build more gestures into my live coding setup. It's something I haven't done much of yet because I realized, well, I feel like gestures need to be, they need to be picked up in a certain space and usually to be understood well or to have precise control. I think also you might need a lot of control over lighting. And I'm going to be playing a flute, and it's not going to be in the same place all the time because I move, especially when I'm going back and forth between a computer. And my hands, they'll mostly do the same thing, but occasionally do certain other things. And then some of the stuff is happening like near my mouth too. And so I actually haven't quite figured out, like, I don't know. I was thinking about this, and like I tried to do a little bit of like tracking, and I was like, I think maybe this is more than I need right now. I think I just need to build my system more and then worry about how I can tweak parameters better, because it seemed to like a lot of extra overhead that might not get me very far very quickly. So gestures are out for me at the moment, even though I'd really like to have them because it would be really useful.
I mean, I kind of gesture is, I guess, my bread and butter. Yeah, I mean, I kind of think of it in two different ways. Like there's lots of kind of points along these interfaces or moments that can be become gesture or become choreographed. So there is the like, there's the input could become gestural, right? So that could be everything from a drawing interface to, yeah, actual specific movements to shapes of the body. It could also be like biometrics, right? So it could be your heart rate or your breath rate. That's a result of moving. I've done a lot with, yeah, motion capture. I've done a lot with sensors, camera systems. So there's like the input, that can be one place where it could be a gestural thing. But I think and I think there's a lot in that category that's been researched a lot over the years in terms of interfacing with computers. But I think what's less researched and interesting is how computers can make gestures, right? So this either algorithmic choreography, right? So this idea of the computer actually somehow involved in the process of making movement is way less explored, even though it's been around since computers. Like the first woman to do this kind of work, Beeman, was in the 60s. She got permission to use a computer at University of at Pittsburgh to choreograph. Right? So it's been around, but it's kind of overlooked. But also, yeah, this idea of like the robot is a really sort of obvious example. It kind of, yeah, and it kind of fell in my lap too. Like, oh yeah, of course, robots need choreography. That's the only way they'll make sense in our world is if we figure out how their movement can have meaning rather than just efficiency. Um, so yeah, so I think what's more interesting is like, how can we make gestural output? And that's where I would like to see more interest. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's it. And to further the question to Agate, knitting is a gesture, right? So I guess in use like literally the gesture is what's producing the outcome, right? Because to change a stitch, don't you have to change the actual
Yeah,
movement of your hands? Yeah.
yeah. I mean, I was thinking about what your question earlier, and that here, I mean, in the speculative system I'm presenting, it's interesting because humans are at the input interface and at the output, the one giving the instructions for generating a pattern, and then they are realizing the pattern. Uh, it's interesting if you see the knitter as like a human compiler, because I was thinking, I'm digressing, but I was thinking about the liveness. I mean, here we are in a live coding workshop, and here you the whole idea of just-in-time compiling is completely reversed. It's like the compiler is the slow, is the how do you call it, the bottleneck, the slow part, uh, and well, I don't know where I'm going with that, but it's an interesting observation. And well, I haven't touched on the topic of knitting machines, but I have the feeling that they're a bit. People tend to have a lot of hopes as to the mechanization of knitting, but it's not that easy. Now, I'm not sure if they're as expressive as what humans can do with their hands.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. And I think that even goes into like what Char asks. Now, what were some ways in these interfaces that you created that surprised you? And for those who make interfaces that other use, was there a way someone else used it that changed the way you thought about it?
Yeah, I guess I could talk about that. It's a tricky question to answer because I think for me, live coding is all about surprise. So every single function I've made has been surprising. And then how it works with other functions is surprising. And it's sort of looking for that unexpected thing which sort of drives every performance forward. So finding interesting ways in which things interact, interfere with each other, was surprising. And then I suppose I've made tidal cycles and instigated strudel as well, although that's much more collective project. But yeah, there's so many ways in which people have pushed things in different directions that it's hard to really think of one. So yeah, my mind's a bit blank. And I'm also thinking a lot about textiles after Agatha's talk and thinking about gesture, how and also, yeah, just coming back to the previous question about gesture again. Thinking that maybe when we talk about gesture, we're kind of missing the obvious things, like just using an editor is a gesture, playing a flute is a gesture, how things move around the screen and how you can see people change their mind and things like that, gestures. If you're knitting when you're feeling tense, then you'll end up with knitting which is tense and therefore too small and this kind of thing. And And if you drink some wine when you're halfway through some weaving, or you can kind of see where that happened, things get more jumbled. So yeah, just bouncing back to the previous question, because that was on my mind as well. But yeah.
So this question was about how have we found surprises in our interfaces, right?
Yes.
So while I'm in the process of building my flute rig, that I wasn't sure if I had time to answer it, and I think this is related, so I'm going to do it now. The memory clearing was actually one of those things that became a surprise. I had started to notice this interesting feedback that I didn't know where it was coming from, and I figured out in the middle of a performance one time. It's something I never noticed when I was coding at home, because my speakers were not powerful enough. But the speakers in performance setting are much more powerful. And so I realized I had to debug that in the middle of a performance to figure out that there was, too much power coming from the mic, even when I was adjusting it. And I had to actually, I was looping, so I was playing over old, I was just recording over old, re-recording over something I already recorded to reuse the track again, because I had to allocate a certain amount of memory. And so I realized that when I had to write into the next version, that, you have to actually delete this, when you want to write the new one, you have to actually delete the old file and then write over it. So anyway, that was interesting. I think it falls under your answer there. But no one else has used my interface yet because it's still under construction. So.
Yeah, so if not, we're going to go to the next question from Giuliano, which is for Kate. First, hello everyone, this is so precious. Thank you for signing up. How would you imagine the role of the computer in the narrative of the performance? And I would like to add a segue because it was related to a question I was going to ask. So first, Kate, you answer that. But also for everyone else, since we're also dealing with interfaces that are not computer, like the flute, like knitting, or even speech, narrative is also a mythology. So what myths do you think is coming from your setup? Like what myths are coming from when you knit, coming from the speech and coming from deleting the code? And I think that's also what Juliana was also expressing. Like, how do these narratives produce myths? And yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know if I've thought too much about the role of the computer beyond it giving choices or pathways. And as a way of giving these sort of, pathways for different interactions. And even in the system itself, so I talk about the agency of the human, the robot itself is also autonomous in that you give it a task and then it makes a choice about how to do that task. So if you're telling it to go to this other dancer, it's attracted to that dancer very strongly, but the dancer's on the other side of the stage. The robot makes a decision oh, I'm actually gonna do this big curve to get there, or I'm gonna turn sharp and go there. And that's something I don't have control over. It's the computer has decided to do that task in that way, and the computer being the robot. So I guess, the computer is about pathways and tasks and giving opportunity is how I'm kind of looking at it, rather than instruction, strict instructions that must be followed by every performer, human or robot. And then this role of narrative, I don't set out to make very narrative pieces. That's not my goal, to have a story arc and characters. I kind of just like to make situations and see what emerges. So I guess that's my sort of methodology for narrative is creating a situation and then seeing how it's read afterwards.
So the other question was about myths then, Kofi?
Myths and narratives, because like we're talking oral histories, right? So
Yeah.
and you've been live coding for a while, so it's like the methodology that comes from the code, and that goes in with like Katerina also saying the documentation, because if we don't have precise documentation, that thing of like what's the problem with AI is that every iteration is a copy of itself. Can we not make an argument that like every iteration that you watch of a live coding is not actually telling the exact feeling? So some of that metadata of like the archaeology, if you want to call it live coding, is technically myth based.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess it kind of relates somehow to the idea of heritage, and generations passing down ideas and myths getting created. But I suppose the problem with talking about myths is that, as far as I know, we're all still alive. Like, and myths, I think, maybe will happen in maybe 100 years' time. And people talk about these weird people in the 21st century or early, yeah, I guess it was the start 21st century, doing these weird things, and sort of reenacting these strange things, these polished stones, and which or whatever they think about when they look back at people showing their iPhones or whatever. So yeah, I guess that's for the next generations really, but it kind of makes me think about something I was listening to about the idea of being a good ancestor. How can the things we do now actually help create these myths or contribute to these myths? I don't think we're the ones who actually create them, but maybe we can influence them in sort of trying to share these ideas, ways of thinking about things, maybe leaving little marks in stones describing what we're doing. I don't know. How can we be good ancestors to the next generations of live coders? Maybe this is more a question for me than the younger members of the panel, but
No, I think it goes in because I think it goes in with what you were saying about the flute rig, Katerina, right? Like you're building this system, right? So like that feedback, if you didn't realize to debug it, wouldn't that have been part of the myth of the thing that like every time you perform, there's this mysterious feedback? Or like when you were talking about like Agave, when we're talking about knitting, right? We have seen some knits that are improper, right? So is there a reason? Is that from the code that made that error, or the human, or did the human try to like screw up the code?
Yeah, in my case, it was just that I didn't implement yet the checks that the necessary checks. But once I have the safeguards for improper knitting, like undoable knitting, I'm curious to see what interactions between very strong patterns can give. Like we were talking about narrative, so knitting is a mostly abstract art, but you have sometimes very figurative elements. Like, for example, this is one of my favorite shawls, and it's called the Wild Swan, and you see like the feathers, and I would be very interested to see how you could glitch this kind of very neat pattern into something maybe a bit deconstructed. I don't know. It could give. It's more on the aesthetic side, open up new aesthetics.
I'm now imagining using one of those text adventure languages to code a knitting pattern, like like what happens if you like start talking about feathers, right? And like it generates a knitting pattern based on sort of how you're describing.
Yeah, you can.
And Katerina, you want to add anything to this thing?
Yeah. So on myths versus folklore versus everyday current conversations, I think there is a tension that I see between sometimes we will see, and I think this is especially since I'm using Mac and I'm not really using it I did write the code and I'm manipulating the variables, but I'm definitely not usually writing all of it from scratch live, you know. So I think there's a tension between like, okay, if someone's like written everything out step by step and you built up the code from the beginning, which when I've done a title cycle set, I've definitely done this. It's easier in title cycles, right? You can do it line by line. The audience can see everything. And they maybe if they're used to live coding, they can sort of pick up on what you're doing. But I feel like one of the things with my max patch is like people can, it's not as impressive, I think, to live coding community in general. But at the same time, people who are in the audience who don't understand live coding can understand what's happening in my max patch. So they can see when I make changes. Whereas when they're presented with a super large thing of title cycles, they can't really see it. So I'm currently trying to make something where I can take that max patch and make it a little bit more changeable, but at the same time also make it something, or maybe change to something else. A friend told me about a library he had in title cycles that I might change to that, but we'll see. But I still want to keep some of that clarity. I want to keep that clarity going forward, and I want to make it so that people can see the effects that are applied once I start applying more effects, like actually see it visually some way. And so like that's the process of where I'm trying to go with it. Because I don't know, I feel like that's like an underlying, like I do think understanding the thought process is important. But it's like what does it mean to see that thought process is something I'm thinking about a lot. And to me, that's where this myth versus folklore, that's what I was connecting with. I think was a little bit off tangent, but yeah.
Oh no. I actually think that's like one of the perfect endings because, like you said, like the whole point of the hybrid life coding thing is to think of these thoughts, and I think you just express a very thing of like past and future, right? Like there is that tension of like from scratch, pre-built, in between, improv, non-improv, and maybe that's something, and I think that's where it goes back to like when Alex was talking about the oral histories or when Kate is talking about like, okay, even though we have nothing, people are assuming that like personifying robots or with like knitting, like what patterns can be done. So I think it's like the perfect way to end it because it gives everyone that thought. Is like as we are ending this edition of HLCI 2024 live coding your niche, it's like what is a niche? And what does it mean to be mainstream? And what myths and folklore do we want the future generation, the current generations, or even the past generations to be able to witness, hear, feel, touch, taste, and all that? So I think that's the perfect way to end it and a good question for people to end. And thank you everybody for being here on the last 2 days for the 4 sessions that we had, and everything is on the YouTube on the International Conference of Live Coding channel. And on the pop-up, you can get information on the speakers and all that contacts. And yeah, so thank you very much for joining us and see you next year.